Orange smoke, the crowd. I mean, this was Nigel Mansell at Silverstone, Lewis Hamilton at Silverstone, Carlos Reutemann in Argentina, Clay Regazzoni at Monza, times 20 probably. This was Max Verstappen at home at Zandvoort. How long have the Dutch been waiting to have not only a Grand Prix back in their country, but also to have a Grand Prix star that they can embrace? And they have both. And it all happened today. It all happened according to plan. Max Verstappen basically led from start to finish, putting aside the pit stops, led from the pole. And it was a glorious, glorious win for all concerned. I think even the non-Red Bull Verstappen fans out there were thinking, yeah, this ain't a bad day, is it? It's beautiful to see a driver of that quality and a car of that quality in his home race on a circuit like Zandvoort with so much history, doing what he did. And it all went according to plan. Well, let's think about what those plans were, though, because if you were Max and Red Bull, you're on the pole, you're thinking, if we make a good start, we're in a position to control this race, but we should never underestimate the speed of Lewis and Mercedes, as we saw in qualifying and as we've seen at various stages of any race since Silverstone, since those stiffer rear construction Pirellis have come into play. So that was the key to win the start. Red Bull's plan B, which we never got to see, would have been what would have happened if Lewis had led us into the first corner and we'd had to try to push Lewis into various stops when he didn't want to make them, push his tyres too hard, whatever it was. Sadly, we didn't get to see that. I say sadly because it possibly would have been a more interesting race. But nonetheless, it was fascinating to see how Red Bull then exercised their plan, which was to lead the race from the start, quite obviously, control the pace, and then match whatever Lewis did, pit stop for pit stop, tyre for tyre, but to try to go conservative as the race wore on. And the reason they chose that option to go to the hard tyre for the final stint was because Mercedes, quite clearly, and in the minds of the Red Bull strategists as well, Mercedes' biggest chance was to make sure that wherever possible, they had their car on new or fresh rubber as the fuel load was lightening. That was when Lewis Hamilton was going to have his best chance of beating Max in the Red Bull. So it got to lap 4. Well, let's start from the start. Absolutely perfect start by Max Verstappen. I was going on yesterday about the two earliest breakers in Formula 1. It didn't actually arrive because Max made such a good start. Lewis made a good start as well from the dirty side of the grid, but it was like this, and so it was an easy turn 1 for Max Verstappen. Breathtaking, though, was the lap he drove. This was Jim Clark at Zandvoort doing one of those jackrabbit starts and consolidating the lead over the lap. Well over a second by the end of a very short opening lap, and this was Max Verstappen pulling away from the two Mercedes, which on the heavy load of fuel were definitely not as quick and were harder on tyres than the Red Bull. To Lewis's credit, he kept Max inside, although to some extent this was Max making sure that he didn't go over the top with his tyres as well, and was just keeping Lewis basically in his mirrors and a lot in reserve as well. So by the time they got to lap 20, it was in Mercedes' court to play the strategy, and that was to bring Lewis in, you could say relatively early, and put him on a new set of medium tyres. And as a result of that, Max did exactly the same thing. I called yesterday's video thumbnail Seeing Double, and we had another very good example of that, of how closely matched these two packages are, although albeit how different they are in constitution. Because in that pit stop, Lewis had a relatively slow stop, something happened on the left rear, I think it was. Max had a very good stop, but in terms of both of their outlaps, they were identical. 1:32.5. Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, head on. And they went into that second phase of the race, both on fresh medium tyres, and Lewis again doing a very good job of keeping Max in sight. And in traffic, it was clear that not only the Red Bull with its Honda torque was very, very good, perhaps slightly better than the Mercedes, but also from Lewis's perspective, it seemed like the traffic was getting out of the way for this national local hero who was the star of the Dutch Grand Prix. Afterwards, Lewis said, I think I'm going to call him Noah because it seemed like the parting of the waters. I think what he probably meant was Moses Verstappen. Not quite sure it runs off the tongue that well. Anyway, it was kind of a stalemate by the time they got to the second pit stops. And this is where, from Lewis's point of view, he felt he could have stayed out for another 5 or 6 laps. And when Mercedes, in strategy, decided to bring him in. And they did that, I think, because that was the second set of mediums they put on the car. This is lap 40-42. Don't forget, we're just over half distance. I was very surprised to see the mediums go onto Lewis's car. And no surprise at all to see Red Bull responding a lap later with a set of hard Pirellis. And after that, it was kind of all over. Lewis pushed really hard, and there was a lovely interchange, sort of halfway through that final stint when Lewis said the tyres aren't going to last. I think we came in too early, and the garage said, and the engineers said, okay, Lewis, just drive to the finish. We'll bring you in lap 4 to put on, try and go for fastest lap, set of soft tyres. And Lewis said, no, mate, no, I want to race. I want to keep going. And that is. I just wish Carlos Sainz would say something like that periodically. I mean, that is where Lewis Hamilton is. I'm sure Max in that situation probably would have said the same thing. And that's what made this race a very good one, even though it appeared as if it was basically start to finish for Max Verstappen. Lewis Hamilton on the absolute limit. Max Verstappen getting the absolute maximum out of that car, doing a great job in traffic as well. But being on the hard tyre and being able to match anything that Lewis threw at him, the advantage was always now firmly with Red Bull. And P4, almost unnoticed, long way back, but nonetheless well clear of anybody else, was Pierre Gasly putting in another brilliant drive for Alpha Tauri-Honda. Very good day for Honda, you got to remember, and for the Red Bull package overall, if you take Alpha Tauri as part of that. But for Pierre Gasly, another excellent drive. Got the best from that car. Again, easy to say, no mistakes, just got the maximum from it, but incredibly difficult to do on a circuit like Zandvoort, where it is very easy to get onto some loose stuff offline, and it is very easy to make errors in traffic, and certainly, of course, into the first corner. And Pierre did a really good job throughout the day, P4. And I keep saying that because I think everyone will probably forget his drive, but it was that good. P5, just as good, another of those drives in a Ferrari that wasn't a great car on the day. It wasn't bad, but it certainly wasn't as good as an AlphaTauri. P5, again, got the absolute maximum from the car. And as the race unfolded, and it came down to tyre management, and it came down to concentration, doing a great job in the traffic, I keep saying that, and in terms of being slightly offline if you had to be, Charles blew Carlos Sainz into the weeds. And that was a great performance again from the Monegasque. But having said all of that, for me, potentially the drive of the race was Fernando Alonso, P6 for Alpine. I said on Friday how good Alpine and Ferrari were looking, and they were really closely matched around this Zandvoort Grand Prix. Early on, there was a moment when they got onto the radio with Fernando and said, how's it going, Fernando, basically? And he said, oh, well, I want to give Carlos Sainz a bit of air. I don't want to get too close to him. I guess he was thinking at that point, I don't want any debris in the front of the car. I want to look after the tyres for as long as possible. And he did run a long way into that first stint on the red tyre, 33 laps, compared with Carlos Sainz in front of him, 31 laps. He then switched to the medium tyre, which meant he had to do a lot of management, whereas Sainz went to the hard tyre, which meant he could be harder on the car and could take it through to the finish. But in the second half of the race, Fernando remorselessly closed the gap to Carlos Sainz. I don't think Carlos, I think all the things we say about Carlos and his driving showed up today. He can drive one way, which is very reflexy, on the limit, brake late, make the odd mistake, back away because he made the mistake on the previous lap. And that is how he drives. None of it is management or manipulation in the Charles Leclerc or even Fernando Alonso way. And that's what we saw today. We saw Fernando just out driving Carlos Sainz. In the same way that I said Carlos should have won the Hungarian Grand Prix, shouldn't have been beaten by an Alpine and an Aston Martin. Today, he should have beaten an Alpine around Zandvoort, as Charles Leclerc did, but he didn't. And Fernando got him right at the end of the race. An excellent drive, a great pass by Fernando to finish P6. And in the end, actually soundly beating his teammate Esteban Ocon. So I would say since he's joined Alpine, this is for sure Fernando Alonso's best drive. And again, probably a little bit under the radar because all that was happening as Max was driving his last 2 laps of the Grand Prix and there was orange smoke everywhere. And that's where all the attention was. But Fernando at this moment was at his very best. And there was a lovely moment about, I don't know, there must have been about 20 laps to go when they were checking in with Fernando. It was a bit like checking in with the pilot of the aircraft saying, what's the status? And he said, tyres are pretty good. And they said, well, at the moment, you're catching Carlos at about half a second, maybe a second a lap. And there's a good chance you're going to be on him by the end of the race. And Fernando's reply was, interesting. And that was it. And then he got the result. Really good to see, and I think excellent for Formula One to have Fernando back there. And we should see that in the context too of those 2 Spaniards, because Carlos grew up with Fernando as his hero. And you could say that, as Fernando's career has kind of petered out to some extent, now it's coming back up again, but as it petered out in the McLaren Honda days and going to Indy, and Carlos Sainz was on this ever-rising graph, and now he's in the Ferrari, you could say, he's kind of taken over from Fernando Alonso. Yeah, well, take a look at what happened at Zandvoort with Carlos looking in his mirror, seeing Fernando Alonso there, thinking, am I going to beat this guy? What's going on? And, Fernando got him. So Excellent. Fernando Alonso. McLaren finished 10th and 11th, Lando ahead of Daniel Ricciardo. Lando started on the medium tyre and looked after it pretty well. He's sitting there patiently. But in the second half of the race on the hard tyre, he wasn't quite as compelling as we've seen in the past. But nonetheless, Daniel Ricciardo did a very good job at one point of trying to hold up Perez for as long as he could and allowing, therefore, Lando to have a bit of space to try and get that P10. So a nice bit of team driving by Daniel Ricciardo. I should say that when Lando was actually racing with Sergio, he didn't make it easy, that's for sure. And I think they touched at least twice coming out of turn one. And I guess that means that Zandvoort isn't that bad for overtaking. It isn't sort of one of these places where you can easily go down the inside. But the way turn one is now, Tarzan hairpin, and the way that next section is down into Hanserag, the Hugenholzbot, there is, you can go two abreast, and that's kind of what happened. And I think they hit twice, maybe three times, Lando and Sergio, but eventually Sergio got him, as he would. I mean, he's in a Red Bull, why not? But that was a good bit of racing. There was also some pretty good racing between George Russell and Lance Stroll for quite a long time. George just never giving Stroll an opportunity to get past. And that has to be seen in the context of Lance Stroll was at Williams, and Williams wasn't good enough, so the father bought Force India, as it was at the time, and that's where they are now, rebranded as Aston Martin. And his George, he's gone to Williams and grown up with the guys there and made that a pretty good car. And here he is beating Lance Stroll in the Aston Martin. I'm not sure many people were seeing it that way, but certainly I think that context is quite significant. And George did a really good job for most of the race. He did get a 5-second penalty as it happened, and he did retire at the end with some sort of gearbox issue. But nonetheless, it was a very, very good day, I thought, for George and Williams to be doing that, to be out there leading the Aston Martin. Sebastian Vettel had a really messy weekend. He was quite quick at the end of the race, but that didn't really mean much. He finished 13th, Lance was 12th. And what about poor old Antonio Giovinazzi? Well, he got swamped kind of on the opening lap. He was overtaken by the Alpines. Carlos Sainz got him. I mean, he was all over. There was a pretty dodgy moment, actually, as they get into the very quick turn 7 with Giovinazzi. I felt a bit sorry for him, really, because everyone was thinking, what is this guy doing? Let's get past him straight away. But then he got a puncture later on in the race. So it was you could say it was a disappointing race, but he did bring the car home, as indeed did Robert Kubica. So yeah, a bit of a shout out for Robert after everything he's gone through from that brilliant early phase of his Formula One career to that rallying accident, which basically stopped everything, to coming back, to doing lots of testing and to getting the odd drive. But here he is replacing Kimi at the Dutch Grand Prix, and he did a pretty good job. He brought the car home. He was about 2-3 tenths off the pace compared with Antonio for most of the race, but good on him. He did a good job. So there we are, a very, very good win for Max. A Max fest in every sense of the word, and he did not disappoint in any dimension. Lewis was right there all day, never gave Red Bull an easy moment, but ultimately it was the result that I guess, I don't know, 80% of the crowd, no, 90, no, probably 99, no, I should think 100% of the crowd actually wanted. A big thanks to Jetcraft. This is now the middle of a triple header. Next weekend, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Can't wait. See you then.